Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Today I've got a video for you that I've had on my schedule for over a month, a comparison of the original Saturn release of Panzer Dragoon versus the recent multi-platform Panzer Dragoon Remake. Why do I bring this up in this fashion? Well, because I've seen 3 big channels post videos about Panzer Dragoon this week, and that's weird since it's not even an anniversary or anything. Anywho, you know the deal here. My video will be different from the others because I'll show you the complete game side by side for both versions with commentary as usual. Now ordinarily I would give you the system specs for each piece of hardware at this point, but that'd be kinda silly in this case since modern computers and game systems are literally thousands of times more powerful than the Saturn, so we'll skip that part. For just a bit on the game itself, Sega released Panzer Dragoon for the Saturn in Japan in March of 1995, and then it was a launch title when Sega sprung the Saturn as a surprise launch in the US in May of 1995. Prior to its launch, every magazine that I had seen at the time compared this game to Space Harrier, and as much as I love Space Harrier, it's kind of a disservice to Panzer Dragoon. It's a polygonal on-rails shooter with much more in common with, say, Galaxy Force 2 than Space Harrier. Panzer Dragoon was amazing at the point it came out. There was nothing like it in the home market. I mean, keep in mind that the PlayStation didn't even launch in the US until 6 months after the US release of Panzer Dragoon. Now on the Saturn, Panzer Dragoon only runs at about 20 frames per second and doesn't come anywhere close to maximizing the potential of the system. But for a first step into the world of polygonal gaming, Panzer Dragoon was vastly superior to any other polygonal shooter out there at the point it came out. And the opening cinematic, despite being grainy and just on a small portion of the screen, was incredible! Now 25 years later, in 2020, we received the perhaps misleadingly titled Panzer Dragoon Remake. And why do I say that? This is much more of what we'd consider a remaster than a remake these days. The gameplay is essentially identical to the original Saturn game. Beat for beat, it just looks vastly superior to the original. Now Panzer Dragoon Remake originally launched exclusively on the Nintendo Switch in March of 2020, before coming to all major platforms later that year. The game famously launched with loads of gameplay and graphical issues, most of which were subsequently fixed in several updates. And I could go on and on about the remake, but we'll save that. So today I'll be showing you the PC version of Panzer Dragoon Remake. It can run very well on relatively weak hardware, but just so you know what I'm running on in this video, my system is a Ryzen 5 7600 with 32 gigs of RAM, a GeForce RTX 3060 Ti, and I have the game installed on a fast NVMe drive. So moving right along, recording methodology. I think I used one save state in the Saturn version, and I allowed myself to die once and continue so I could start a stage with full health. Other than that, this is just straight up gameplay of both versions of the game. Alright, let's get on with it. And we are underway. We start with the opening cutscene, which you can see looks quite a bit different in both versions of the game. Now I want to stress, I saw this game, the Japanese version of the Saturn release, in March of 1995 before it came out in the US at an import game store. And I thought this opening cutscene was about the coolest thing I'd ever seen on a game system at that point. I mean, it looked way better than the video we'd seen in any Sega CD or even TurboGrafx CD games that used full motion video. And the design is interesting, but obviously when you look at it today, I mean, it's really primitive, but it's still got an awesome kind of weird style to it. When we look at the opening for the modern game, I think you can see kind of a problem already. I mean, obviously the quality is much higher overall, but when we look at the people, their design is just so much more generic. I mean, that main character in this, the Rider, looks like a polygon model that you can just buy right in the Unreal store. There's nothing really unique about the character. Meanwhile, in the original Saturn game, while obviously vastly more primitive, it stood out way more from the crowd than this game does in today's market. So obviously in the remake we've got a lot more dynamic camera angles, the backgrounds are way more detailed. And one other thing I will note is that one of the other videos that was released a couple of days ago said that these cutscenes in the remake are real-time. They're not. They are video. You can see obvious video artifacts in many of the scenes here. Now this is another scene, again, it's technically vastly superior in the modern remake. But stylistically, there's something about the original that just stands out more. And I think we can drill this down to one primary thing. When Panzer Dragoon was released on the Saturn in 1995, this was a game that was designed by some of the people, that were at one of the top companies trying to put out almost a flagship-style product. Meanwhile, the modern PC game of Panzer Dragoon Remake, which also appeared first on the Switch and then on all the other platforms, it's not the same kind of product. This was designed as more of a budget entry just to get people thinking about the series again. And I think that was a big mistake with this game. And I want to get something out of the way here. I'm not just dumping on the team that made Panzer Dragoon Remake. I think that it's a good game, and I think it's worth playing. I'll tell you that right away. So I'm not telling you not to get this. But I do want to look at it in the context in which it was presented when it was released in the year 2020. Any in-depth look at these titles has to take into consideration the circumstances during when each was released. Saturn Panzer Dragoon was one of the first major console releases that was a mainstream title to use fully texture-mapped polygonal graphics. Meanwhile, Panzer Dragoon Remake, 25 years later, came out when all this stuff was bog standard. And as I mentioned before, the new hardware is thousands of times more powerful than the Saturn. Now, having said all that, one thing I just don't like is this design of the Dragon Rider in the remake. It's just so generic, it looks like it could be from any of like 1,000 other games that came out at the same time. There's nothing distinct about it, there's no real style here, it's just a generic looking guy, and that's a bit disappointing. It's pretty amazing how the intro was recreated, almost beat for beat, exactly based on the original, I've got to say. It's very strange that they didn't really alter any of the timing, and I'm glad that they did it this way, because it makes doing a comparison like this all the more satisfying. As you know, usually when I show you comparisons, I skip cinematics and things like that, but I thought this is one unique case where it is absolutely worth looking at both. And here's something else I'll point out. The way that the dragon looks, obviously, we have a lot more detail in the textures and everything in the modern version. But again, artistically, I think it's superior in the original. When we look at the dragon in the modern version, which we'll see when it goes back to him in the desert in just a moment here, you'll notice there are very sharp lines on, like, the little claws that are along the edge of the wings. Things that just make it look kind of cheaper than it should. It doesn't look organic. Like, you see all the sharp angles on the dragon arms by the wings there and everything? There's just something that looks very off about it in the new one. Especially there, you can just see these sharp, flat angles, and it really kind of takes away from the visual style and flair of the entire scene, which otherwise looks really good. Now, I'm not going to sit here and try and convince you that the Saturn opening for Panzer Dragoon looks better than the opening for Panzer Dragoon Remake. That would be silly. But there are stylistic elements that are better, I feel, in the Saturn version. Overall, when it comes to, just quality and the technical details, Panzer Dragoon Remake's opening looks vastly superior. I just wish the style was a little better. And this desert, This looks like it could be the desert in any game I've played in the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. Very indistinct. Alright, so here we go with the game proper. So after the tiny little window that we had to use for the Saturn's intro full motion video, we are now in full screen gameplay. Like most NTSC Region Saturn games, Panzer Dragoon runs in a resolution of 320 by 224. I mean, you can see it's really chunky looking these days. Everything is very, very simple and simplistic. Not a lot of polygons there. The water doesn't look super great. They tried to implement a little bit of a warping effect to make it look like it was rolling and flowing. But again, I've got to stress, the first time most people saw this game, they were blown away by this. You have to keep in mind that most people were still playing games on the Super Nintendo or Genesis at the point that Panzer Dragoon was released in May of 1995 in the US. When it was like opening their eyes to a brand new level of technology, which, I mean, I guess it wasn't like that. That's exactly what it was. So for the remake here, you can see, yeah, vastly superior, visuals. I'm running it at 1080p here, even though you can run it a lot higher than that. But I'm only going to run the video at 1080p, so it didn't make any sense to really do it any higher than that. On the PC version, at least, you will get a constant 60 frames per second as long as you've got semi-respectable hardware. Like I mentioned earlier, you don't need to have a top-of-the-line system to get this game looking great. I mean, realistically, guys, this runs okay on the Switch, so you know you're not going to need a super beefy PC to run it pretty well. On my last system, I was running a 2060 Super on an older Ryzen 5 3600. Also, completely without a hitch on that. And I haven't tried it on my lower spec devices, just because I haven't had the urge to. But I imagine it's going to run pretty decent on those, and you'll have some visual settings you can tweak, even though there's not a whole lot. And again, I do want to stress that the gameplay is so close to identical in these games. So you still have your buttons to rotate around the dragon, you have a front view, a view from each side, and a rear view. So in the front view, you've got sort of, a chase view by default, but you can change, where the camera is. On the side views and the back view, it's first person if you go with all the default settings. And one thing I do like with the remake, and they can do this because we don't have the same limitations that we did on the old hardware, while this is a transition in the Saturn version where the screen shifts and you can see it's clearly, loading in some new stuff, and the remake, it just continues seamlessly. And that's definitely, nicer for the gameplay. There's also a lot of elements in the Saturn version that were 2D, like a lot of the projectiles that enemies fire at you, where in the remake, these are 3D objects. Here we can see mesh transparencies on the Saturn, where they just dither, basically, draw dots on every other pixel to try and make it seem like there's a transparency when there really isn't one. Transparency was definitely one of the Saturn's Achilles' heels when it came to polygonal graphics, even though there are some games that do implement some sort of 3D transparencies on it. And also here we are during our first boss fight. You'll notice, again, very similar between the two versions of the game. There's really only one boss where things are, I would say, notably different, even though they're not vastly different. And that's going to be the level 5 boss, and I'll talk about that one when we get there. And yeah, you can see we have plenty of fancy lighting effects and everything in the new version, all the bells and whistles you would expect from something released in the year 2020. One thing I will comment on that I don't like in the new version is the water. It looks like you're just floating over a sheet of ice instead of actual, rolling waves and stuff. Now, I don't think the Saturn water looks realistic or anything like that. I'm not going to make that argument. But the sheet of ice look in the new version is just one of those things that is kind of off-putting, I think, in this one. And it just doesn't look like you would expect, you know, a real ocean to look when you're flying over it. Just about done with him in the PC version after I've taken him down in the Saturn version. There are going to be a few pauses in this video, but not too many. So that's mostly good because I'll be able to play it straight through most of the time. And of course, while I already mentioned resolution, on the Saturn we have, 4:3 visuals, while on the modern versions there's 16:9. I don't have any monitors in any form factors other than 16:9, so I don't know how the game runs on ultra widescreen and things like that, if there's any modes for that. If you're interested in that, you're going to have to look that one up for yourself. Alright, there he is, fully taken down in the modern Panzer Dragoon Remake also. And if you missed it on the Saturn, when you're done, you get a rating on the percentage of enemies that you shot down throughout the level, and you get credits that allow you to continue based on how well you did in that percentage. So the other thing I'll note here now that is not so apparent just by looking at these games is in the default normal settings, the PC or modern version of Panzer Dragoon Remake is quite a bit easier than the original Saturn version. So here is our next cutscene. We don't have a lot of cutscenes in this game, just a few between a couple of levels. As you can see, the remake sticks really close to the source material and just basically updates it for a more modern look. Alright, here we go on to stage 2 in the desert. There are giant sandworms. You can't have some weird fictional sci-fi desert planet without sandworms, right? And again, you'll notice how strikingly similar even the enemy movement patterns and placement is between these two games. That's why, I said that calling Panzer Dragoon Remake a remake is a bit of a misnomer. A remake would imply that a little more is done to the game versus the source material, where it uses it more as a reference. In this game, for Panzer Dragoon Remake, it is basically just the original game in widescreen with much fancier graphics. Now, targeting in the remake is something else worth talking about. Originally, they didn't even have the original reticle that you see here. They added that in an update with the spinning squares. Can you even imagine they launched the game without that? But anyway, yeah, that was something they added later on. And it's a little less precise, I would say, than aiming in the Saturn version. I mean, while you have full, modern, smooth analog support in the remake version of the game, sometimes it's a lot easier to lock on things than it is in the Saturn version, and I found other times it's a lot tougher to lock onto things. It sort of depends on the angle. If you're on an extreme angle, I find it quite a bit tougher to lock on things in the remake. But most of the time, I find it way easier to lock onto things in the remake. So that is one way that the game just, feels different than the original Saturn release. And again, we've got much fancier lighting, here in the remake, as we would expect. And one other thing I'm going to note is that as far as sound goes, I'm going to mostly just let the sound from Remake play, because it's only very gently different from the original game. One thing I will notice on the Saturn original is if you play with default settings, the effects almost always drown out the music. And I don't know why they balanced it that way. you can go into the options and change it so the music is a little bit louder. And I definitely recommend doing that. In the Saturn version, I'm playing it with the default settings, just so you'll know what it's like when you load up the game and just play it. Now let me talk about the music in a little more detail here. So Panzer Dragoon was often praised for having an amazing soundtrack back in the day. And I would say that 3 of the songs in this game, the opening music that plays not during the introductory cinematic, but just before you press start, is absolutely amazing. The first level song, fantastic, and then the ending song is completely gorgeous, right? Very cinematic, very orchestral. It's beautiful. But all the other music in the game, for all the other levels, I would say, is mostly just kind of there. Like, most of it is not good or memorable in any way once you hit stage 2 through, like, stage 6. There's maybe one exception. There's one song that has some nice percussion in it. But other than that, a lot of the in-game music for the other levels that has more of a almost techno-y sound to it. It's not quite techno, but more electronic, I guess. All that stuff does not even come close to measuring up to those 3 orchestral pieces that we hear prior to the opening, during stage 1, and during the ending. And as you can see here again, things are much more impressive and cinematic in the remake. Going after our boss dragon here. This is the one we've been chasing from the beginning, and he will eventually be the final boss of the game as well. And this is one thing where I think Remake really kind of let us down a little bit also. There was a huge chance to expand on this world, even just a little bit. Have a little bit more to what's going on and what's happening story-wise. And I know when it comes to action games, usually I say the less story, the better. But Panzer Dragoon has always been cinematic. It's been a cinematic experience from this very original Saturn release. So this is one game where I'm not saying you need to bog it down, with long cutscenes between levels and things like that. Just having a little bit more to fill in the gaps on what's happening story-wise here would have helped enrich this experience a bit, I feel. So as long as the cutscenes are skippable, I'm alright with them. You could even have had, arcade and story modes. So you can have your arcade mode where you just go play the levels with no cutscenes, and then your story mode where you've got all the cutscenes in it. I think that would have been an ideal way to approach this. And they could have added, a few levels. Sure, it would have made the game longer, but, just have it save between levels and you come back when you feel like it. I think bumping this up to 10 with some extra story and some gameplay, additions for maybe later entries in the series, like the sort of Berserk attack from Panzer Dragoon 2, or, even some other additions that came along later, would have led to Remake being a much more fulfilling experience than it was. Because the first time I played it, I've got to tell you, I was pretty disappointed in it. And I only spent like $3 on this game. I bought it when it was on sale. Now, I'd originally thought about getting Panzer Dragoon Remake for the Switch when it was announced and when it launched first for the system in March of 2020. But the whole point of the game was that it was going to improve the graphics of the original. So, I thought, why would I want to get it on what is technically the least powerful platform of all the platforms that are available when it was eventually going to come to the others? So in the end, I passed on the Switch version and just waited. And it always seemed insane to me that you would make the Switch sort of the lead platform with an exclusivity period for a game that's all about the graphics. That's what it is. The only thing really changed here is the graphics. So, why lead with the weakest hardware? I just don't understand the thinking behind that. I mean, I would have been fine if it had been a Switch exclusive and wasn't coming to the other platforms, but when you know you're releasing it for everything, why lead with the absolute weakest version visually? Who knows, maybe Nintendo threw some money at them to have a period of exclusivity on the Switch. It's the only thing that makes any kind of sense for why it would hit that platform first. So just to be clear, the Switch version of Panzer Dragoon Remake does not look as good as the PC version that you're seeing in this video. It doesn't look vastly worse or anything like that, but you're not going to get the same level of quality out of that version of the game if you decide to purchase that one. In fact, at first on Switch the game only ran at about 30 frames per second, but through updates they've increased that now by lowering the detail to get better performance out of it. Alright, that's enough criticism of the decisions that led to this game and wild speculation for now. I think I'll jump back into doing that whole comparison thing that you're here for. Now for this stage, I will say, despite a bit of the generic appearance of the environment, that I do think this one just works better in the modern version of the game. So this area just looks a lot better in Panzer Dragoon Remake. There's a little bit more going on visually, and it just, it feels more lived in, I guess. Like it's more occupied. On Saturn, things are a little bit rough here. And it doesn't look bad on Saturn, it's just a much simpler aesthetic for the background than we see in the remake, which again, makes sense considering the giant leaps in hardware that have happened between the generation of the original game and remake. Now I haven't talked about enemy design much because, well, it's very similar between the two games despite, the new technology on display in remake. But if we look at the planes here at the end of this level, they look quite a bit different in remake versus the Saturn original. And there's really only, I would say, like 3 or 4 enemies that look significantly different like these do. We're almost up to the boss for this level. And we'll see it approaching right now. And the way that he is sort of introduced is, as you can see, quite a bit different between the two. Much more cinematic introduction in Remake versus the original, where it just kind of sidles in and then starts attacking you. Where on the Remake version, they've decided to do more of a proper introduction to the boss. And as we get started on fighting the boss itself here, mostly the same. And there's some minor tweaks they made here in Remake versus the original. You'll notice timing is different. It looks like the amount of damage you do is different, but I'm not 100% sure. So I'm a little hesitant to just come out and say that. It looks to be that the damage you do is slightly different in each, let me put it that way. And I can't remember on the Saturn version if he reverses the direction he spins in, if you let it go on longer. In the Saturn version, I took that form out before it would have had the chance. It probably does, but again, I just don't remember. It's been a while since I've seen it do that. Now the methods of attack here, again, they're the same. It does oddly look like the background is going by a bit faster on Saturn versus the remake version. I don't know if that's my imagination. You guys can tell me what you think looking at it in the comments. And this boss fight is kind of annoying, not because it's difficult, just because it takes a while. A lot of the bosses in Panzer Dragoon have more than one form. So we're going to see things like that quite a few times before the game is over. But one other thing I'll mention musically about Remake is, even though it sounds mostly extremely similar to the original, there are some things that are minorly updated in this version. And also the volume balancing is definitely better in it than it was in the Saturn original. So with the default settings for volume and Remake, you'll have a better experience sonically than you would with the default settings for sound in the Saturn version. I will say the level coming up next is a tough one. It's the first really hard level in the Saturn version, but it's also probably my favorite level just from the environment that you're in. So far, everything has been mostly outdoors. I mean, we had one tiny little scene in level 1 where we were inside for a moment. That's all going to change now as we head into episode 4, which takes place entirely within a small, tight corridored structure. And in some ways, I really like the look of Remake on here, but there's still... it's just lacking something to show that it was, a top-tier project. There's just something that's a little too basic about it, something a little too simple. And one thing you'll notice here also is it seems, again, like there are many places in this level, and you'll see this a few times, where the movement, the forward momentum, is a lot faster on Saturn than it is in Remake. And there's no question about it, for a lot of these scenes. And yeah, the backgrounds on Saturn version here are very, very simple. But still, they do a pretty good job of just, giving you a sense of the place that you're in. Hit this little boneyard style area, and you'll notice the doors are a lot wider in Remake. Again, I think that was primarily done to just help the level design stay similar in a 16:9 format when compared to the 4:3 format. So rather than just basically making everything super wide and extending it out, they've actually redesigned the background a little bit so it's wider to begin with, so it looks good and not, stretched like you would see if you took a 4:3 game and just stretched it wide open. And for Panzer Dragoon, just difficulty-wise, if you haven't played this game, the first 3 levels are pretty easy. The first level especially is really easy, but the first 3 are pretty easy. Once you hit this level, once you hit stage 4, things take a dramatic turn for the more difficult, and they stay hard for the rest of the game. So pretty much any time you play it, you'll probably get through the first 3 levels on your first try. But actually finishing the game, if you're new to it, probably going to take you a few play sessions, especially in the original Saturn release. While, as I said before, things are generally a little bit easier in Remake, and you might be able to just, complete this one in one sitting, you're probably still going to have some trouble, especially in the very last level. So just a heads up, when you start playing the game, it's going to seem pretty easy, but it's not easy throughout. And again, you can see just the movement is so much faster on Saturn here. I kind of miss that sense of speed in Remake. It would have been nice, to have seen it do the same thing. Alright, here we go. Here is our boss for level 4. This is, I would say, the first of the super annoying bosses in this game. which the last three are pretty much super annoying. This one blocks most of your shots until you blow his arms off, and then from there, he's pretty easy to take down. Now, it feels like in the Saturn version that the technique is a little different. Feels like it's easier to blow off his shield arms and especially hit him when he's a little more exposed. And it also feels like when he does his attack where he launches his claw at you, basically, that it's way easier to avoid on Saturn than it is in Remake. Which is odd because in Remake it's a little bit slower, but it's just way tougher to completely dodge in that version, I find. And you'll see me get hit by it, I think at least 2 times here, out of the maybe 3 or 4 that he does it. Yeah, there's one right there. And you will definitely see it again. And I do like the updated design for this section right here in Remake. This hexagonal hallway with all the pipes and just intricate sort of semi-organic, semi-mechanical design. I think that really goes to the heart of the look of the series, and they did a really nice job here. And I think this section looks better than most of the other sections, you know, that we see in the other levels. So as we go on here, you can see what I was talking about with this boss being, you know, quite annoying. It takes a lot of effort to take this one down, and they definitely tried to mislead you, especially in the original release for the Saturn, by giving him such a small energy bar. Despite that small energy bar, as you can see, you're in this fight for a while. We are working our way through there. One other thing I guess I'll talk about while we have some time here is there was also a Sega Ages release of Panzer Dragoon for the PlayStation 2. And it's mostly similar to the Saturn game. It basically ups the resolution of that version. It still runs at a lower frame rate. It's a little bit nicer if I remember right, but I haven't played that version in like 10 years. But it's another one that you might want to consider. It's probably a little bit easier and more accessible than the Saturn version these days. And even if you're going the emulation route, you'll probably find it a little bit easier to deal with PlayStation 2 emulation than Saturn emulation, which is crazy. Saturn emulation, as I've pointed out many times on the channel over the last few years, has definitely gotten better, but it's still, lagging behind a lot of the other systems. And even with this game, there's 1 or 2 parts where the music cut out, where it would not have done that on real hardware. And I had that happen during, I think, level 5 one time, and then also during the ending credits, that gorgeous song at the end, unfortunately, it cut off before it completely finished, and I was rather annoyed at that. But we can hear the whole thing in the Panzer Dragoon Remake anyway, so it's not that big a deal. Now, coming up for Episode 5, after we, have just gone through these tight corridors with doors closing in on us and everything, and super fast navigation and going through all these rapid direction change tunnels, we get a gigantic open area with no real background. The background in this level in both versions is really just sort of digital wallpaper. And that's fine. I mean, we're going for a different atmosphere. It's very different than the prior level. So I understand why they wanted to go back to an area that's so open like this one. So here we're taking down a whole bunch of these airships. And in Remake, we're still taking down the airships. Enemy placement is still almost exactly the same, but they've really prettied up, this foresty area and added a lot of hills. They had that nice little arch we just flew through and things like that. So on the Saturn, we have barely anything, sticking out of the flat, floor that is really a canopy of trees. They just have, a few other trees that pop out of the top and things like that. Meanwhile, in Remake, you can see we've got an entire, true full 3D environment. But again, I want to stress, despite seeing that, lovely environment, it is still really just wallpaper. You don't actually interact with any of it. So it's just there to look pretty, and look pretty it does. They did a good job here too. And I want to stress, I don't want to seem like I'm beating up on the team that made this game. Obviously, they, had a mission to do, and they did it. They created, a modern version of the original Panzer Dragoon. I just wish that the vision for this game had been more than that. Because this was, a marquee series for Sega during the Saturn era. Really, one of their only true, completely original home marquee series on that entire platform. Sure, we had big games like Virtua Fighter and Sega Rally, Virtua Racing, Daytona, and all those things for it. Yeah, Shining Force even, unquestionably huge games. But most of those had their origin either in the arcade or on the Genesis, things like that. Meanwhile, Panzer Dragoon was a wholly original property created specifically for the Saturn platform. And that, really gave it something a little extra during that era. This was one game you knew was not going to show up on the PlayStation. And until the demise of Sega as a, first-party console manufacturer, it stayed exclusive to their platforms. We wouldn't see, any type of re-release of Panzer Dragoon until that PlayStation 2 version that I mentioned, just a little while ago. And that one, I want to stress, it's not a whole lot different from the Saturn original. So don't go in expecting vastly improved visuals. If you hadn't played the Saturn version for a long time, and then popped in the Sega Ages version on the PlayStation, you might even be wondering, is this really any different? But if you saw them side by side, you'd see that they definitely smooth things out for that version. But it's very, very similar to the original Saturn release. So here comes our boss for episode 5. This boss is probably the most annoying in the entire game, especially if you get here with low health. Because there's a couple of parts where you're almost definitely going to take a couple of hits. And first up we have these annoying airships right in the beginning, and then we get up to the boss proper itself right after that. So this one we'll see the attack pattern is a little different in Remake versus the original. And you'll see as it begins to turn right after this phase, it sort of goes in a different direction. But yeah, the key thing here, if you play this yourself, once you get up to this part, use your regular non-guided blasters and take these things out one layer at a time as quickly as you can. When you take a layer fully out, that means that layer is not going to fire those cannonballs at you. So the fewer of those you have coming at you, the much more likely you are to survive this boss fight. And this is only the first form. As I said before, there's more than one form to a lot of these bosses in this game. And you're going to see its second form coming up in just a moment here. So I'm just getting caught up in Remake to where I was in the Saturn version. Since some bosses you'll get through faster on Saturn, and some you'll get through faster in Remake. It just varies by the boss. And in the Saturn version of this game, the boss doesn't launch those planes that you saw unless you don't finish taking out the cannons in time. So the pattern is mostly similar, but there are things that are a little different. And then again in the Saturn version, you can see on this part, the landscape scrolling speeds up dramatically. So it adds a lot of tension to this fight, and it just, you feel like you're going fast, and the thing zooms up on you, and it launches some of the rockets that don't have the fan blades, the ones that just target you right out. We don't see that in the PC version. And that little glitch on the PC version there, that wasn't a cut from me. That happened in the actual game, where the thing started to fall over and then it kind of repositioned itself and it started to fall over again. That was the game itself. I don't have any cuts in the PC version at all during this recording. I only have pauses in sections where I needed to let it, freeze so the Saturn version could catch up to where it was in a few points. So just something worth knowing. Here we have our final cutscene. Again, it's a lot more moody and atmospheric in Remake. So that's something that I definitely like better. I think this scene looks a lot nicer in Remake than it does in the original. Not sure I'm wild about the way they did the rain, but oh well. Can't have everything, I guess. It's also interesting how they redesigned these enemy ships a little bit. They've made them a lot curvier. And we'll see a few of those actually throughout the course of this episode. So episode 6 is our final normal level. The last level is a boss fight only. So episode 6 is also the only episode that doesn't end in a boss fight itself. So after we finish this one, we will see a boss fight. And then once again, we've got sort of that icy or glassy look on the water in this level in Remake, and I just don't like it. And as far as the levels go in Remake, disappointingly, this is my least favorite one. It's the one that they really could have done the most work on, and instead it's the one that I would say is the least successful. It just looks very plain, and it just doesn't seem like it was as upgraded as much as it should have been for this. There could have been a lot more going on here. We could have had more structures, just a more impressive design. What we get here is just sort of the very basics, of a simple city. And yeah, there's more to it than there was in the Saturn original. Obviously, we have a lot more detail. It just feels like it could have been more impressive still than it is. I will also say, oddly enough, for Remake, this is the one level that I feel like is actually harder in Remake than it is in the original. And I think a lot of that has to do with targeting angles. So remember how way back in Stage 1 I mentioned, might have been Stage 2, that targeting things with the reticle can be both easier and more difficult in Remake? Well, this is a level where a lot of it is often more difficult because the angles you're at make it tougher to find that one that locks on to the enemy. Meanwhile, in the Saturn version, I didn't have any problem like that in this level. It just felt like it did throughout the rest of the game. Now, the control is a little bit stiff on Saturn, I'm not going to deny that. But in some ways, it still just feels like it's a little bit tighter than it is in this version. And it's a little bit more reliable, especially when it comes to locking onto enemies. And then once more on the Saturn, you can see they've really upped the speed on this section. Whereas Remake doesn't up the speed in the same way. It seems a little more, constant. In the places where it does go faster and it speeds up, it doesn't speed up much. I do find it interesting how those sort of plant things that have the enemies behind them look a little more organic on Saturn than they do in Remake, where they look very mechanical. And here are those curvier airships that I'd mentioned during the cutscene. They're a lot curvier in Remake versus the original. And again, I understand why things look like they do, in the original. You have very low polygon budgets, so you had to make things out of as few polygons as possible to basically just get the point across of what you're looking at. In Remake, they had the luxury to make things a lot more detailed and use a lot more polygons in them. But still, there's something about the designs in the original that I still think help it stand out a little bit more. We're just about done with this final level and getting ready to head into the boss fight. So you can see that's technically the end of episode 6 without a boss. My shooting rate is pathetic in both versions, but especially worse in the Saturn. Which is odd, considering it's easier to lock on to enemies in that one. At least in that level. Here comes the dragon, and look at all those video artifacts there. You know, this is obviously recorded footage and not real-time footage. I don't want to call out the channel that said this was all real-time, because I like the channel a lot and I don't want anyone to think badly of it, but that was definitely a mistake. Okay, and here we go, our ultimate fight in this game. So here you can see the dragon we've been chasing all this time is now inside an even bigger dragon. What's better than a dragon inside an even bigger dragon? Nothing, that's what. Alright, so we continue here. Now the fight proper is actually starting. And the pattern is mostly the same. This boss is a little bit closer than some of the other ones. Now, this boss fight, one of the things I'm going to mention is how hard it is very much determined on how quickly you can take it out. If you really focus and lock those homing shots onto him as quickly as you can and just keep plugging away, you can get him before he does some of his worst attacks. So the way I always did this boss fight is to just go at it hardcore as soon as you can. Take some damage if you need to, but try and take him out. If you get to the parts where he's going to shoot like his big fire breath at you, that's tougher to avoid, there's a good chance you're going to die. So in both versions, I'm using basically the exact same strategy. You don't want to get hit by these tail whips, but they're easy to avoid, pretty much just by going up to the top of the screen a little bit, and you want to just keep plugging away with your homing shots and blasters as necessary. Now, if I were to let this fight go on, which I did in some earlier playthroughs while I was getting prepped for this video, it's just so much harder if it keeps going. He's got an attack where he blasts a lot of fireballs at you very quickly that do a lot of damage and are very difficult to avoid. So, like I said, once you hit that stage of the battle, there's a good chance you're not going to make it. You can still win, but it's a lot harder. Here, I like on the Saturn version, we can see sort of his busted horns, while on the remake version, he looks just kind of normal. In the Saturn version, the fall into the ocean is a lot more dramatic. In the remake version, the fall into the ocean is very abrupt. And that's it for the game itself. So next up, we are going to head into the final cutscene. The PC version here, or remake I should say, gives us our ranking before the final cutscene. On the Saturn, we get our ranking after the final cutscene. So again, on Saturn, like with the other full motion video segment at the beginning, we see all of this in a very small window. Well, on the remake version, it's actually in kind of a window also. It's sort of wider than 16 by 9, so it is also, in a way, sort of letterboxed. And once again, for Panzer Dragoon Remake here, it is really impressive and impressively strange how close they stuck to the events and the timing of the full motion video that was created for the Saturn original 25 years before it came out. So it's very cool to see these things side by side because of that. But what do all of you think? Are you glad they stuck so closely to the original cutscenes, or would you rather have seen something new and fancier? Let me know about it in the comments. And with that, we have now completed both versions of the original Panzer Dragoon. Panzer Dragoon and Panzer Dragoon Remake. Cutscene lasts a smidge longer on Saturn, and then we get into the ending. Now the ending, we have the gorgeous music in both versions, but we only have the really nice artwork, these sort of paintings, in the Saturn version. For the PC release, we see concept artwork, which is kinda interesting, but it just doesn't hit the same. I really wish they had included all of this artwork from the original game into Remake. So the ending is pretty long. So here's what I'm going to do for this video, guys. I'm going to just go over my closing during the ending, and I'll have my closing end when the ending ends. So that way there's not going to be anything afterwards. So just before I get to the closing, just a few final general thoughts here. So Panzer Dragoon on the Saturn was sort of Sega's, let's call it, big budget AAA game for the system when it was new, and it was sort of its marquee original title, one that hadn't been ported from anything else. Panzer Dragoon Remake, when it hit consoles and PC in the year 2020, was just not the same caliber of release. It was a lower budget game, and it was targeted at a lower budget price. And it's not bad for what you get. So again, I don't want to crap on the work that the developers did for this game. It's a good game. It's worth playing. It's fun. I highly suggest anyone with any interest in the series check it out. And for what it is, I can appreciate it. But as I said before, the first time I played it, I just wasn't very happy with it, just because it was exactly the first game with practically nothing, added to it. And while I really loved the first game when it was new, that was a long time ago now. They could have definitely done some things to improve it. And as I've mentioned several times throughout the video, what I really would like to have seen was an actual remake, where things were added to it, where we had maybe a little bit of expansion onto the story of the world, maybe a little bit, more in terms of levels, more cutscenes, and stuff to break up the game more, just so you would play it in multiple sessions. And then, on top of all that, had sort of this Saturn mode where we had all of these levels exactly as they appeared in the original. I think if Sega had taken that route and asked for the game to be designed along those lines, this would have been a bigger success. As it is, we were supposed to get, a remake of Panzer Dragoon Zwei almost right after this. And here we are, halfway through 2023, hasn't come out yet. I don't know that it's ever going to come out. Alright, so at this point, I'm just going to go ahead and do my standard closing. And there you have it. A complete comparison of the original Panzer Dragoon and the 2020 release of Panzer Dragoon Remake. So which is better? It's a harder question to answer than it should be. The original Panzer Dragoon, despite its ancient visuals and super low frame rate and low resolution, in some ways just feels like a tighter gameplay experience than the new one. It's also definitely more challenging. Remake is absolutely not a bad game, and I respect the work that went into it, but in some ways, it just feels very much like what it is. A sort of low to mid-budget modern port of a 25-year-old game with basically no changes outside of the visuals. And hey, you might love that Remake has no changes. This game is a pure port, right? But like I said during the commentary, PD Remake feels more like an unlockable mode in a proper remake than a remake itself. This series deserved a true comeback, with a redesigned game that updated the gameplay to a higher standard and incorporated some of the improvements from the game's sequels along with some new elements. Also, of course, they shouldn't have launched the game with all of the issues it had. That certainly didn't help its reputation, and is probably a big part of why the game is so often on sale for under $3 these days. I also don't think the Switch was the right lead platform for this. Anyway, tell me, what did you think about seeing the original Panzer Dragoon and its 2020 remake compared? Which do you like better? What's your favorite Panzer Dragoon game? I'd love to hear all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it. If you haven't yet, please subscribe for more retro gaming goodness. If you want to support the channel, you can now do that through channel memberships, or as usual, on Patreon or Ko-fi. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.